I'm Erik Messerschmidt, Director of Photography on Raised by Wolves, and you're listening to the Go Creative Show.
Hey everyone, my name is Ben Consoli. I'm a director and owner of BC Media Productions. And this is the Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers. So today we have Erik Messerschmidt, Director of Photography. Now he was on a couple of months ago for his work on Mindhunter. And now he's back talking about his work on the HBO Max series Raised by Wolves. Now, if you guys have seen this show, you know that it couldn't be any more different than Mindhunter. So we talk about how he made that transition, lessons he learned, and maybe things that he'll employ on his next season of Mindhunter. Who knows? But one thing we do know is we talk a lot about shooting day for night, which is something that he wasn't totally comfortable with at the beginning. And I know we can all relate to that. But he learned a lot. So if you guys are interested in day for night shooting, you definitely want to check out this episode because we have a pretty good conversation in the middle of the show there about it. Let's dive right in because there's so much to discuss with Erik Messerschmidt, ASC, the Director of Photography for Raised by Wolves. So I'm here with Erik Messerschmidt, ASC, talking about Raised by Wolves on HBO Max. Erik, welcome back to Go Creative Show.
Hi, Ben. Thanks so much for having me back.
It's seriously only been like 4 months, I think. It really has been a quick turnaround. You have been busy. You certainly have been busy.
I have, yeah. No rest for the weary.
Oh my God. Last time you were on, we were talking about Mindhunter. And we did an Instagram Live with you too. So we had a lot going on. We had the episode talking about Mindhunter. We did the Instagram Live, both of which are on our YouTube page and gocreativeshow.com. So you guys can check that out. But you are backed for Raised by Wolves, which has really gotten a lot of attention over the past few weeks. Directed by Ridley Scott. I'd love to hear about kind of how you got onto this project. Did you jump on immediately from Mindhunter? Was this your next project?
Well, no, actually, we were in the midst of prepping World War Z, the second film, and then the movie shut down, and Raised by Wolves sort of just popped up as an opportunity, and I met with Ridley and I met with Aaron, and we had a couple phone conversations, and they invited me to join the show. So yeah, sort of it wasn't something that it wasn't a long developing process. It sort of popped up as an opportunity, and I jumped at it. Obviously,
Of course. I mean, had you worked with Ridley before?
Never. No, I never met him. And so it was it's really cool to be a little part of his world for a little while.
What was the experience like? I mean, he's one of those directors that you like. He's one of those directors that his name is like the director name is kind of why you see his projects sometimes. Like his name sort of transcends his projects in a way. He's just one of those guys. I mean, not many of them out there in the first place, and to get an opportunity to work with one. I mean, what was the experience like? Well,
I didn't shoot any of the episodes that Ridley directed. So I was one of three cinematographers that worked on the show, Darius Wolski and Ross Emery. But of course, we're working under the umbrella of Ridley and the creative vision of Ridley. So that it was fantastic for me. It was completely different from anything I'd ever done before. Total world building. Alien planet, obviously, far in the future. So just creatively and aesthetically completely different from Mindhunter, obviously, but really anything I'd ever worked on. So it was it's fantastic. It was a really cool experience. I mean, we shot in South Africa, which was new for me, and we it was an incredible location, many incredible locations actually, and great African crew, which was always, it's great when you get to go to another place and you see how other people do what we've done, but in a different way. Everyone has a different approach, and I think part of the great joys of my job is learning from and experiencing how everyone does the work.
What were some of the differences?
They were in South Africa. It's a little bit of it's kind of a blend of the British system and the U.S. system of lighting. So in the U.S. we have very distinct delineation between grip and electric, and they're for the most part kind of equals in the lighting process. In South Africa, in the UK, the electricians do almost all of the lighting work. They set the flags, they set the bounces, things like that. In South Africa, it's the grips do a little bit more, but not quite to the level they do in the United States. So it's that's a significant difference. Also, we had a very, very large crew, much larger than I'm used to in the United States.
Really?
Yeah, and it's it's just part of the methodology down there, which was kind of exciting actually, because I could ask for things and they would get happen so quickly, because you just have an army at your disposal every day. So we were moving around some big set pieces, and we had some heavy equipment we had to work with, and the weather is a little bit tricky in that part of the world. So it's never short on a surprise, so to speak. But I had an amazing experience. It was fantastic.
I didn't know there was even that much difference in, the lighting in the UK versus the US. I had no idea.
Yeah, just in working practice on the set, the same work gets done. It's just how we do it.
So having that larger crew, was it a hindrance at all, or was everything better because of it?
Well, look, anytime you have people on the set, people bring stuff. They bring trucks, they bring equipment, and it's all in service of the creative direction of the show. But it is stuff you have to move. Trucks you have to move, people you have to move, people you have to feed. So you're not as nimble, I would say, for sure. It requires some forethought. You sort of have to think about where everyone's going to be and where they're going to stage their stuff and where they're going to sit down and where they're going to eat. And, with scale comes restrictions always, but also to some degree, it's also how we got the work done, and how we were able to move these really elaborate set pieces, and how we were able to work in the rain and work in blistering hot sun. And, so there's pros and cons to every situation, obviously.
Yeah. And was this kind of larger set approach, larger crew approach, just the way that things are done in South Africa? Or is it because it was a Ridley Scott project with, I'm assuming, a large budget?
I think we had some big set pieces that had to get managed, for sure. We had big builds. So the construction crew was large. I think to some degree, South African productions, at least larger budget South African productions, tend to have quite a few people on the crew. Not in when you work in India, same kind of thing. Lots and lots of people. South Africa's not quite that to that extent, but yeah, we had an army, and it was great. We were able to do all sorts of stuff, and we made use of this kind of vineyard property that was out in Stellenbosch, which is outside of Cape Town, about an hour. And we had the owner had provided us with a huge piece of property which we could dig up and build sets on, and it functions sort of as our alien landscape.
Well, Todd, just before we go any further, just to bring everybody up to speed, can you give us a little synopsis on what the show is? And, from there, I'd like to kind of talk about your different environments, because you have some pretty drastically different environments in this show.
Sure. Well, the show follows two androids in the not so distant future who are trying to resurrect humanity. There's been a religious war on planet Earth that has destroyed the planet, essentially, and in an effort to rebuild humanity, these androids have taken human embryos to this habitable planet Kepler 22b, and they are raising these children as the next human race, essentially. And the show is sort of, like in all science fiction, it's an allegory for the human experience, and the show is a little bit of, it is trying to address parenthood, what it means to be a mother, what it means to be human. So thematically, it's big for sure. It's tackling some really heavy subjects, and it's there's a little bit of kind of ethnographic or anthropological study in it. We're sort of watching these children grow up, slightly out of the context of planet Earth, and addressing a lot of the same issues that normal human children on planet Earth deal with. So it was fun to kind of explore it and see where we could go. And the amazing thing working for someone like Ridley is, we could really explore it far. We could really go for it. And Aaron's writing, in particular, he's tackling some big stuff, and he's really thinking outside the box. I mean, it's very different. It's not Star Trek. It's very different and cool.
And talk to me about the locations that you have. I know you said shooting in South Africa, but you've got like a variety of really different looking and feeling locations on Raised by Wolves. Can you walk us through each one of them and talk to us a little bit about how you approach them?
Sure. Well, the show, the characters first land in this kind of barren, semi-desert, very arid landscape, and they build a settlement there, and there isn't a lot of food. It's very cold at night. It's always snowing at night, and it's sort of a bright night. We did this day for night treatment that Ridley had conceptualized with Darius Wolski for the first 2 episodes, and we carried it forward. But
and we're definitely going to talk about that, by the way.
Life is not easy where they've landed, and they're constantly looking forward to building up their strength and building up their resources so they can travel to the tropical zone of the planet where they think that life will be easier. And the locations we had this winery, sort of vineyard, big piece of property that we cleared and turned into a barren desert. It was not that way when Chris Seegers arrived. It was lush and green, and it was plowed and cleared and graded, and the sets were built there.
That's crazy. So you stripped that whole land and turned it into a desert.
Yeah. Yeah, mostly because we like the mountains, So yeah, it's a huge undertaking for sure. And then there's other locations within the property. There's sequences of the show where Mother goes and finds a pod, and she logs into the pod and sort of collects her memories. And that was a forest not far from our other location. I mean, a quarter mile, half mile away. And there were actually leopards that were living in this forest. Periodically, people would see them. But yeah, so those were sort of our 2 main locations. And then within the scope of that, we could resurrect piles of rocks or trees, and sort of we had the ability to move the pieces around and turn that raw land into a new part of the planet. And then, of course, there's stage work and some location work in Cape Town especially for the flashback sequences to Boston, which are peppered throughout the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk about those too, because there's kind of a unique approach to the way you handled the flashback scenes. Let's focus for a moment on that difference between the wide open space of these desert scenes that you have, where everything is, lit by the sun. It's very natural. It's all, top light, just this big open landscape. And then juxtaposing that with the forest, which is dark and dreary and hard lights kind of peeking through. Those are 2 drastically different looks, but they all have to maintain some similar aesthetic, or else it doesn't make any sense for the show. So what are you doing from a lighting standpoint to keep consistency between those two completely different looking environments?
Well, Ross and Darius and I, we talked before the show and sort of what direction we were going, and Ross and I took over after Darius shot the pilot, and what we did is we took the show, and it particularly in the desert landscape, so to speak, desert landscape sequences and the forest, this very kind of desaturated gray, barren look. And we didn't really want, and I think it came from Ridley, he didn't really want it to ever feel lush and green. So we pulled a lot of color out of the image, and we lit with some contrast. The day exteriors, we used a lot of negative. I did for sure. Big blacks on frames, and we would bring them in close and try and get some contrast out of the day exteriors. And kind of leaned into the sun. It's like the sun is, I think cinematographers have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with the sun. It's always moving. And it's not always aesthetically pleasing. And it was this kind of ethnographic documentary style that Ridley put together in the first episode of like, well, be aesthetic, but also try and be real, and recognize that these guys are in a harsh environment and lean into it a little bit. So we did, we embraced the front light. We used harsh side light. We kind of went with it because we're not glamorizing this place at all, And then in the forest, we wanted it to feel a little bit more kind of muggy and glum, and that kind of like, where the mist sort of hangs on the floor, the surface of the forest floor. So we used a lot of smoke, and we tried to find locations where it would be backlit, so people would be silhouette and gray and cold. So that's sort of what we, and that's kind of, we wanted it to feel like the same planet, but a different part of the planet, because Mother has to fly and she goes, in the story anyway, she's going quite a distance.
Yeah. And exactly like you said, you're creating a new planet, so it has to have some sort of consistency, but at the same time, it's like our planet certainly doesn't have consistency. Different parts of it look completely different. So I think you did a great job of, and of course the other cinematographers did a great job of having it all feel cohesive, but feel like you're in a different part of that planet. I want to talk for a minute about the idea of vulnerability in the cinematography, because in both of those locations, in the big desert landscapes and also the forest, very different feel, very different look. But I think there's a vulnerability in both where there's kind of this nakedness where you're just out in nature and you really have no protection in a way. One's a very large landscape that's totally open, and certainly there's vulnerability there. But even in the forest, like, yes, you're confined to a space, you have some boundaries around you with the trees, but it still feels vulnerable. Can you speak to me about sort of, first of all, is that even something that you're thinking about as you're shooting this? And if so, what are you doing to create that feeling of vulnerability in the cinematography?
I think, our characters don't really know what's around the corner ever. And they are, they're pioneers. They're Lewis and Clark, they're out in a completely new environment, and they don't really know what the threats are. So we try to embrace the space. There's wide, really epic wide shots, particularly at the settlement, of just this kind of vast emptiness. And they've built this kind of semi-protective dwelling, but it's, we wanted to show the space as much as possible. So we used wide lenses, close to the actors when we could. We did move the camera quite a bit. We trying to show the scope of it as much as possible. And I think, there's the show has this kind of objective, kind of voyeuristic quality to it, where we're watching these people sometimes from afar. We're on we're either very wide or we're on relatively long lenses, kind of observing what's happening. And as the show progresses in the later episodes, it gets a little bit more. It gets a little bit more subjective, I think, because the story evolves to a degree where we're not watching them survive. We're actually participating in the conversation as the audience. But I think in the earlier episodes, it's very observational in its camera direction for sure, and its cutting pattern and its style.
Yeah, and I think it's really resonating just as a viewer. It gives you that nice. I don't know if you don't like science fiction, that's the show science fiction, that's for sure. But I think what I love about it is that blend of the humanity with it. Like everything feels grounded, even though it's clearly a science fiction story. Everything feels very, very grounded, and I think it's interesting to see because the style of it has a lot of that Mindhunter feel in it in a way. And I know you didn't do the entire series, but it has that feel in a way where the colors are muted. It's very, very real and human feeling. It just so happens to be in a different planet. So I think, you're tailor-made for this series, I think. And we actually have a question on Instagram from Storylit Films. The question is, the show is much different than Mindhunter. What was your approach for filming this? So I think we talked a little bit about that leading up to this, but can you just dive a little bit deeper into maybe the differences in your approach between Mindhunter and Raised by Wolves?
Oh boy, there's lots. There's lots of differences. I really made an effort, sometimes more successfully than others, to leave Mindhunter behind and not carry any of that baggage forward. I think you want the show has to exist as its own being, and I was collaborating with two other cinematographers, which was a relatively new experience for me. So we were sort of figuring out what the show was together, and taking what Darius had done and building on it and expanding it and embracing it and supporting it, and it's we used a lot of cameras, 3 cameras pretty much, sometimes 4 the entire day. And so when you work that way, long lenses, wide lenses, off eyeline coverage, it influences the aesthetic in a completely different way than we had done on Mindhunter, which was very, ostensibly single camera and very composed and structured filmmaking.
And you did the entire series, right? Mindhunter?
Yeah.
So you did it all. So in this show, Raised by Wolves, you're working with 2 other cinematographers, Ross Emery and Darius Wolski. Am I saying that correctly? So what was the experience like going from a project where you're the sole cinematographer and director of photography to this, where there's more of a collaboration?
Well, it's, at first I was a little bit intimidated, to be honest. I wasn't quite sure how that was going to work. And, I was used to kind of carrying the photography solely on my back, and which is simultaneously freeing and also exhausting, This was cool because I had a little bit more time with the directors to prep. Ross was shooting an episode and I would spend 30 days with Sergio or James Hawes or whoever, and we would prep his block, and so we had a lot of time together, and we got to really dive into what each scene was, and that's a real blessing. That's a huge plus. And I think if you look at all 3 of us, our episodes all look a little bit different, but it's the same show, and that's fun. We would. Ross and I would text screenshots to each other of what we had shot and be like, "Oh, that looks great, man!" And sometimes, Ross had sets that he would open up in his episodes. They had sets that he would establish, and then I would have to carry forward, and so we would discuss how we were going to approach it. This virtual monastery set, Mother frequently goes back to, and she goes back in episode 4, I think, and then in 5, and then in 6. Sort of replaying these memories. It was a set that Wolski hadn't shot, but Ross and I were going to shoot, and we were prepping the whole time together, and that that was cool because we got to kind of throw some ideas back and forth of how we wanted to approach it, and we had different scenes in there with different needs. So it's kind of exciting to see what Ross was doing, and be like, okay, that's going to work for me, but I don't want the walls as bright because my actors are in the center, and so we would discuss what each of us needed and find a way to make it work, and it was great. I mean, we didn't know each other before that, but we became great friends after. It's really cool to work that way.
How do you decide who gets what episodes?
I don't make that decision. The producers made it, and it's sort of how the schedule works out. I mean, we alternate. Some of it had to do with availability. Ross came right in after Wolski finished, and then I came a couple weeks later, and
you're doing sets of two.
Exactly.
So is that
yeah?
Okay.
Something happened with the director that was going to shoot the finale 2 episodes. Somebody became unavailable, or I don't actually know the full story, but I was supposed to shoot 9 and 10, and then a variety of schedule changes happened, and they had to pivot with directors, and because of it, they couldn't find a director to do both 9 and 10. So Luke Scott came back. Luke had done some episodes. Actually, Ross and I both worked with him. And then he shot 10, but we couldn't prep simultaneously. So I unfortunately lost out on the finale, which is unfortunate. But it's still, they did beautiful work.
Can you talk to me about your camera package on Raised by Wolves?
Yeah, we shot Alexa 16:9 Panavision glass. We didn't shoot large format. It wasn't really part of the aesthetic. We weren't looking for super shallow depth of field necessarily. We were on relatively long lenses for large sections of the show, and then on very wide lenses on some of the interiors. And so I don't think large format would have really helped. We started, I think, Ridley and Derek had done. They'd done a lot of stuff on Zooms in the beginning, and we continued. Ross and I continued to shoot on Zooms. In fact, we did a lot of it on the 19-90 Panavision Zoom, which is not a particularly great lens, but
really?
but it's really versatile and it's very small. And then we sort of, as the show progressed and it got more subjective, Ross and I I think we just sort of transitioned into primes because it felt more appropriate for the content. The camera was participating in the scene more. We're sort of inside the world a little bit. So we started to shoot more on primes. So I think the latter 5 or 6 episodes are mostly primos.
What do you mean participating in the scene?
Well, if you look at the early episodes, and it's done this way from a very specific point of view of stepping back and observing in this kind of ethnographic kind of nature documentary way to some degree. I think you take these people and you plop this alien in the alien planet, and it's like we're a National Geographic documentary, and we're watching from afar. So the lenses are relatively long, and there's lots of cameras picking it, and the cutting can be sometimes jumpy or it's off axis, and that's the style that we were going for at the beginning. And then as characters sort of become more comfortable with the location and they sort of start to really inhabit it, and the audience accepts them as inhabitants of this planet and not just visitors, we start to bring the camera into the conversation. So there's less overs, there's less, it's a little bit more structured, I think, stylistically. And that was something that just happened organically. It wasn't necessarily, I think Ross or I or the producers discussed that as an aesthetic direction. I think it just sort of started to feel right as we got the scripts in, and we started to see what direction the show was going. So there are these kind of very science fiction based flashbacks where it's these kind of epic set pieces where we back on planet Earth that we got to be a little bit more gestured with, and a little bit more playful with. So
What does having multiple cameras on set do to your lighting strategy?
Well, it changes it. I try to think of the set, the lighting on the set as what it should be. I don't really. I mean, I consider um, all the coverage angles in the lighting plan. I sort of try to pre-visualize it as much as possible and talk to the director about where we're going to put the camera and how we're going to shoot it, and then light it from that perspective. But once we've committed to a direction, a lighting direction, or a style or an aesthetic, I try really hard not to relight the set much shot to shot. So, and particularly in this show, I think it worked pretty well. We for the most part were able to put the camera wherever we wanted, and sometimes you have to embrace the front light, sometimes you don't. But I think Ross and I are very similar in that way. We both sort of approached it as we were lighting the room or the space, and then we would cover it as we needed to. And there are obviously things that you can do, like we for the day exteriors we would plan around the sun a lot, and there's quite an elaborate kind of battle sequence in 6 that we planned extensively. Wendy Alport, the first AD, and Sergio Mimica-Gezin, who directed it, we spent a tremendous amount of time considering where the sun was and thinking about how we were going to break it up and storyboarding, and knowing that we were going to use 2 or 3 cameras at the same time. So it's like in that sequence we got one long lens of them running and shooting, and then they come around the corner and the other camera picks it up. It's not necessarily multiple pieces of the same action. We're trying to consider the whole action and breaking the scene up that way with multiple cameras. Does that make sense?
It does. And we had Pavel Pogorzelski. His name is tough to say. The cinematographer for Midsommar, a couple years back, and that whole thing was shot. It was basically everything was daylight. It was daylight all the time.
Yeah.
That was kind of the point of the film. And when they shot the film, wherever they shot it, I don't remember, but the sun was out like 20 hours a day or something like that. It was crazy. So, and if you guys want to check that out, it's from July 2019. We were talking about Midsommar and Hereditary. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing how many challenges like kind of appear when you're dealing with the sun as your sole light source. And it's like, especially when you're doing battle scenes and things like that you're talking about, it's like, how do you plan a battle scene knowing that the sun at the first shot is going to be in a completely different direction as the last shot? It's like amazing to me that those scenes even get pulled off.
I mean, I was fortunate to have a very prepared director, who knew exactly how he wanted to cover it. He knew what the action was, and also he recognized the benefits of planning around the sun. So to some extent, we had to shoot certain parts of it out of sequence, which is challenging, especially if you have bullet holes or blood or costume changes, or stunts.
Of which you had all of them.
It comes from the top. It comes from encouragement from Ridley and the producers to make sure it looks great. It comes from a prepared director who is considerate and recognizes the benefit of considering the sun as part of the story. And then and careful blocking and thoughtful blocking, and that is the benefit, I think, to some degree of the multiple DP system on television, where we could sit in the director's office for several days and break the scene down and think, okay, well, he runs from here to here. Okay, there's 3 paths he can take. The sun's going to be here. If he takes this path and we cover it from this angle, we can keep him backlit the whole time and it'll feel consistent. And but you have to have the right director in that instance. You have to have somebody that is that understands that conceptually and sees the benefit.
And a respect for scheduling. My God, like you can't have somebody that just does take after take after take after take and blows the schedule. Like you need a lot of what's the word? I want to say restraint, but that's not the word. I'm just not even going to say a word. Then I'm just going to leave it be. Somebody listening will fill in the gaps. But you need a lot of something, whatever that thing is, to stay on schedule. And my God, it just seems insane. I want to transition to your day for night shooting in this, because there's quite a bit of it. And the nighttime looks very different than the daytime in these environments. It's snowing, like you said, every night. So talk to us about your approach on for day for night in your episodes.
Well, I hadn't done a lot of it, actually. I hadn't done a lot of day for night, and suddenly we were thrown into it, and it was so much fun. We Ridley had this idea that there's multiple moons on this planet, and so nighttime is a little bit brighter than it is on Earth. In fact, there's still a little bit of light in the sky. The moons are up and they're always kind of reflecting, so that everything is a little bit lifted. And sometimes you see clouds, but we went for this very blue, kind of icy steel blue look. And it's it can be challenging. I mean, we built some LUTs. We built a kind of day for night look, and then we found actually that it looks drastically different overcast versus sunlit. The day for night look, where you have sharp contrast from the sun, is a very different feel than the kind of muddy, sort of just top light, that kind of soft ambient top light that you get in cloud cover. And we, both were equally interesting to look at. It was just they were very different looks, and so we had to build different LUTs depending on how much contrast there was in the scene. And we used snow candles. I mean, I think we burned every snow candle that was available in the Southern Hemisphere. In fact, I think they were shipping them in from Italy. We used a lot of atmospheric smoke, and we used a lot of foam-based snow as well. So we had kind of every trick in our book. But Ridley said, if you can make the weather worse, always do it. So we did.
I like that. I like that philosophy. Yeah, it's like I wasn't even thinking about that, but yeah, your full sun day for night versus your cloud covered day for night. And the other thing that's kind of unique about this environment when you're doing day for night is that you're in white sands. So you have this bounce that kind of gives it kind of even if you were to be shooting at night with a lot of direct, like full moonlight, it would still have a different look than a traditional nighttime shot anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, Ross and I, both of us talked a lot about wishing that we could crush it more. We wanted it darker. But then, of course, because the contrast is so much different, as you step on the exposure and you push the exposure way down, you end up having to put light on the actors. And there's this interesting balance of not overlighting the actors and sort of managing the contrast. And the wider shots, it doesn't matter how many 18Ks you have, you just can't get them out of the frame. So there's this kind of very delicate balance we were constantly fighting of figuring out how much we could underexpose it and get contrast in the image without making the actors completely silhouette, and we weren't quite sure how much sky replacement or set extension was going to happen either. So we were sort of always erring a little bit on the side of caution, I think, with the exposure.
Have you done a lot of day for night prior to Raised by Wolves?
I hadn't. No, I hadn't. But then, funny enough, after that, there's a whole sequence in Mank that we did day for night.
Oh, really?
So we took that technique a little bit forward into that movie. But
did you go into it with any preconceptions that you were like, that were quickly shattered?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially, I had heard Darius called me and he said, "Hey, just so you know, we're doing this day for night thing," and I was like, "Oh God, really?" And
why? Why was that your first reaction?
I think you think of the sort of night when you hear that term, at least naively, I was like, I just thought of 1950s day for night at the beach, with lots of blue filters, and I was like, oh, okay. And then I got there and I saw what he had done and where they were going, and I was like, oh, this is fun. Okay, we could do this. and then Luke and I did a scene together that's in, I think, episode 3 or 4, where Tempest kills a creature, and we, it was my first day for night sequence, and I had a great time. I mean, it was really fun, and we're out there, and you think about things in a little bit differently than you would day exterior, because you're really looking at shapes and atmosphere, and you consider contrast in a different way than you would day exterior anyway. So yeah, it was, proved. I ended up really loving it, to be honest. I was like, every time there was a day for night scene on the call sheet, I got a little excited, because it was, there's a part of you, if you're day after day exterior in the desert, it sort of gets a little bit tiresome,
Yeah. So it was exciting just because it was something different, or was it exciting because it was like just this challenge that you were able to overcome, or what was exciting about it?
Well, I think it was because it was an evolving aesthetic that we were trying to develop, and we weren't quite. It wasn't like we had a formula that we just threw in place. We had to develop it, and Ross and I would, we both would have different successes and different failures, and then we'd call each other and be like, "Oh man, I put all this backlight on Abu, and I just underexposed the background, and then we put this really aggressive LUT, and I crushed the toe, and take a look at the still. What do you think?" And be like, "Oh, that's great, because I got this other scene." And so we would kind of throw ideas back and forth, and I think the inconsistency of the night work is exemplary of us trying to kind of figure it out, to be honest. But it wasn't something we really wanted either, for it to be like, oh, it's always has to look the same, because the environment, sometimes it's really cloudy and it's just this kind of drab, soft top light, and other times there's, piercing moonlight, and, just like it is on planet Earth. So we kind of leaned into it. I mean, I hate to say the word embraced it, but we did kind of embrace it,
Yeah. Well, I think that's cool. A moment ago, you were talking about your approach to contrast was different in day for night than traditional daytime. Could you just give us an example of what you mean there? How did your approach change?
Generally, for me, especially in South Africa, in that environment, like you said, all the white sand on the ground, I'm always trying to increase contrast day exterior. I'm bringing in lots of negative fill, or shading the actors with overheads, and really trying to put lighting direction back into it. And we were lucky, actually, because we were shooting in the South African winter. So, in fact, Wolski called me and he said, "You're lucky. You're going to get all the good winter light," because the sun was relatively low. It was only ever 30 degrees or so above the horizon, because we're so far south. But still, trying to get as much shape as we could practically, and still maintain being able to shoot it, between 11 and 2, which no cinematographer likes. But but we did, and so I'm always trying to add contrast in the day for night, particularly in the sunlit day for nights. We're often trying to reduce contrast, because we need a detail in their faces, and that's what I mean. We're sort of trying to ride that edge of, well, how much contrast does it look realistic and like a different time of day, without completely losing detail in their face. And you're bringing in extra bounce, you're putting artificial light on the actors' faces, or trying to stage them in side light. I found initially, I thought, well, backlight everywhere, and actually, surprisingly, I found that the side light looked much better, looked more believable than the backlight did. So we sort of transition. I think both Ross and I had that realization, and we would encourage the directors to stage stuff in side light as opposed to backlight when possible. But we had set pieces you couldn't really move, so sometimes you just have to accept the blocking for what it is.
I imagine too, you have a little bit of a benefit by having the white sand, because it sort of justifies some light coming up from the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And and the other thing, the thing that ruins day for night in most cases is the absence of practicals. Street lights, car headlights, things like that. We didn't have that problem. In fact, there's a nursery set, which is this sort of orange igloo.
Yes.
And one of my first day for night sequences, that was in the background, and I called Justin, the gaffer, over, and I was like, "Hey man, can you put 7 maxi brutes in that thing. And he's like, oh, yeah, sure. And we came very close to melting it, actually. But we filled this thing with maxi brutes. I mean, every single one on the truck.
Wow.
And then once we had the day for night look on it, it's glowing like it's got some light on inside. But I mean, if you saw it during the day, it looked ridiculous. It looked like we were setting the thing on fire. But then, Ross called me after that. He's like, oh, great idea. That's, I'm going to steal that. And I was like, yeah, man, steal it. So we are constantly trying to find ways to sell the idea a little bit better,
The color of that igloo was so great too. Just having that color, especially since the show is so desaturated, and then having that strong, warm, it's just awesome. I loved it.
Yeah, we had 2 of them. We had one on stage and one on location. And the one on stage, we could remove panels because it's
cool.
quite small. And we're constantly, like Ross and I were throwing ideas back and forth of how do we get the interior one, the one on stage, to look more realistic, or match better with the exterior one. It was fun. I love that set.
In our last few minutes, I want to talk about these flashback scenes and your approach to them. So just for the people that may not know, can you just kind of explain what the flashback is and how it is, in fact, a departure from the regular show?
Well, Mother, Amanda Collins' character, Mother, doesn't quite know her history. There's like a memory. She's missing parts of her memories, and she's been reprogrammed. She was a necromancer, is what Aaron calls her, which is this kind of weaponized android that the Mithraics had built, and she's been converted into this into a caregiver by an atheist hacker. And so she discovers this through a series of flashbacks. And she does this by actually plugging into the computer and experiencing this as a simulation. And so we have a series of sequences, sort of, the kind of like Christmas Carol kind of thing, where she goes back in time and observes herself. And so, in episode 5, there's a series of scenes where she has to watch herself undergoing this transformation. So she plays 2 characters ostensibly in the scene, and that was kind of challenging. We did a bunch of it motion control. We did some of it split screen. We were trying to figure out ways to include both of her in the same shot as much as possible, and move the camera so it felt authentic and not like a parlor trick.
Yeah.
And so, in the sort of the end of episode 5 and the beginning of episode 6, there's a series of scenes. And that was, I really looked forward to that stuff because, to be honest, there's parts of the show, and it's no criticism of the show. It's just what it is. There's a kind of Swiss Family Robinson aspect to it, and so the opportunity to go back in time and go back to the kind of roots of science fiction of these contrasty interiors and use a little bit more color was exciting and fun, So we really leaned into it heavily. And we, there's sequences, these kind of battle sequences on the streets of Boston and the scenes with Cadmian Sturgis where she's getting reprogrammed. It was really fun.
So I think like the flashback scenes is when you have the most, like the stuff that's the most familiar to the viewer to see. It's the most like regular world look. And I mean, like you said, it's in Boston, so it's on Earth. So, but when you go into these flashback scenes, like, are you thinking about, okay, how do I do this in a science fiction way aesthetically? Or are you thinking to yourself more, no, my goal here is to give a sense of the typical world that the viewer is going to be familiar with. This is my opportunity to kind of ground them.
No, we weren't trying to ground them. If anything, we were trying to make them a little bit uncomfortable, I think. But it was in a selfish way, it was nice to be able to work with light sources that weren't the sun, It was like something about that, and there's to be fair, there's scenes in the settlement too, where we're inside the barracks at night and we had fire and they had these light orbs that we had built, these kind of practicals that they had salvaged from the ship that they could use as a light source and kind of lantern thing. And so we had that opportunity to bring a little bit of variety to the image. But the set pieces, I think just the variety in set pieces makes the show interesting, and it makes sense contextually in the story. And Tom McCullough, who was the production designer, really went for it. And we had this meatpacking facility in Cape Town that was repurposed as this kind of post-apocalyptic landscape. So, in episode 5, when she gets captured by Campion Sturgis, that's a huge exterior that's been dressed as this kind of Boston war-torn street. It was quite an elaborate set, and then we had a bunch of interiors built in that same facility that we could do, where he reprograms her, and there's a prison sequence. We shot I think it's in episode 2, the training camp sequence where all the child soldiers are being trained. All that stuff was done there.
What was your favorite scene of the 2 episodes, or the episodes that you had done?
Well, there's a couple. I think there's the end of episode 5. Campion Sturgis says goodbye to Mother, and he puts her in the ship, and it's the first time we kind of see emotion on her face. The sort of softness, the softer side of Mother. So I think up until that point in the show, the audience is trying to figure out who she is, and she's trying to figure out who she is, and she's trying to manage her emotions because they're new to her, and we see this very bizarre, but particularly touching scene between her creator and herself, where she's trying to, reconcile the fact that she's leaving and she won't ever be able to see him again. And it's pretty, it's a pretty touching moment, I think. And then we extend it in the beginning of episode 6. She goes back and she replays that sequence, and she steps into herself and kisses him. And there's this really kind of delicate moment, and that was all done motion control. So we could put 2 mothers in the same shot, and that was fun technically to kind of figure it out and conceptualize it, but also from a story standpoint, it's a really important scene in the movie. And then there's this in episode 6. There's quite an elaborate, shall we say, intimate scene with Mother and Campion, which is where the show starts to kind of deviate and become very existential, and so that was fun visually, but also interesting because the show starts to take the viewer down another direction and starts to really kind of open up. So I think the latter episodes, the viewers are in for a real treat, because it's pretty spectacular what happens.
A couple of minutes ago, you'd said you when you were doing the scenes where there's 2 mothers and you have to have motion control and the camera movements and maybe split screen. You had mentioned the idea of avoiding the look of a parlor trick. Can you talk to us about the pitfalls of when you're doing these kind of split screen, 2 of the same character at the same time? What are some of the pitfalls people fall into, and how can they be avoided? Well,
I think the audience is really smart, and the old tricks of cinema are tiresome to the audience now. Everyone's seen I Dream of Jeannie, or Bewitched, the snap and then they disappear, and you do it in split screen or a cut or whatever. And that works in some moments, but in my opinion, it's sort of like the audience knows how you did it because they can do it with their iPhone, and they expect more. And so any opportunity we can take to make it slightly more elaborate or slightly more complex or more invisible. So it's not about what we're doing, but it's really about the story. I think we should endeavor to chase. I think so it was less about there being 2 mothers and showing how we could put 2 mothers in, and more about, well, she has to see herself. There has to be 2 of them. How do we tell that story in a way where it doesn't seem like, oh, well, they just did a split screen and they changed her wardrobe and now she's over here and it's in a 2 shot. And we were constantly looking at that, but without trying to make it about that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And lastly, I think most important of anything we talked about, I have a suspicion that Raised by Wolves is this global effort to bring back the mullet, and wondering if well, everyone has a mullet. What is going on in this show?
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I have to say, I really admire. We got there, and I saw Amanda in the dolphin suit, and I saw Travis with the mullet, and I was like, what did I get myself into? And then I think what Ridley was doing is just leaning into it. Like, this is totally different. And if you look at Logan's Run or whatever, it looks so dated because it is it's referential of a period of time in humanity on planet Earth, right? The costumes, the hairstyles, everything, or like Moonraker, any sort of dated kind of show. And so, to just go completely the opposite direction and completely embrace it, I think is fantastic and really cool and interesting. So, I did have my hair cut by the hairstylist on the show. I needed a haircut while I was in Cape Town, and she offered to cut my hair. And there was a moment where I was like, well, what are you going to do?
Yeah. Can I please have a mirror the entire
she said,
time?
I promise you, I'm not going to give you the Travis Fimmel. And I was like, okay, cool. As long as I don't get the Travis Fimmel, we're cool. So.
Oh my God. Well, the show is called Raised by Wolves. It's on HBO Max. It's an excellent show. And I think as of taping, 5 episodes are out. So there's still a few more to go, 5 more to go, right? It's a 10-episode series. So who knows, by the time you guys hear this episode, the whole thing may be out there. Who knows? But you should definitely check it out because, of course, we love Erik Messerschmidt, and also the show is great. You guys are just going to enjoy it. So check it out for yourself. Raised by Wolves on HBO Max. Erik, what is next for you? What are you jumping on?
I'm in the midst of prep on a top secret project, a film.
We won't say anything. You can tell us. We'll be quiet.
Well, I will fill you in at a later date, but we're going to start shooting after the beginning of the year, so it's pretty exciting.
Nice. So you're seeing productions coming back for you?
Yeah, stuff's happening. Yeah, I just shot the finale episode of Fargo in Chicago.
Oh, no way. I didn't know you worked on that show. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so old friends of mine. So I kind of parachuted in and shot one episode, and then I'm off to do this film. So we'll see.
Oh, that is great.
Yeah, stuff is happening.
We're going to have Pete Consoli and Dana Gonzalez on to talk about Fargo.
Oh, fantastic.
Season 4. I'm obsessed with that show, so we've covered it all 4 seasons. And but I mean, this season especially is going to be really interesting because it got shut down halfway through.
That's right. Yeah, we just went back and did. I was there because Dana Gonzalez is a very good friend of mine, and he was directing the finale.
Oh, nice.
So I shot it for him. Yeah. But
wow, that's great. All right, well, I have to ask him about you.
Yeah, say hi to those guys. They're all old friends for sure.
Erik Messerschmidt, where can people find you online? What's the best way?
Instagram's perfect. Just at @Messerschmidt. Really easy.
Really easy. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. You guys are already following him, though, anyway. Who am I kidding? So it's there. Instagram.com, Messerschmidt. Erik, thank you so much for coming back on Go Creative Show. We love having you and already looking forward to the next appearance.
It's my pleasure, Ben. Thanks so much for having me again.
All right, I want to thank Erik Messerschmidt ASC for coming back on the Go Creative Show to talk to all of you guys about his work on Raised by Wolves. I hope you learned a lot, especially in the day for night shooting. Now, obviously, I'm not doing big, huge productions like Erik is, but there are often times where I have to do day for night shooting, and I learned a lot from this episode, and I hope you did too. Please let us know in the comments as well. What else? I want to thank our sponsors, MZ Education for Creatives, and remind you that you should get 10% off from OpenReel if you go to openreel.com. And when you purchase, make sure you let them know you heard about us, or you heard about them from us, and then you get 10% off. So those are the 2 people I want to thank on the sponsor side, but I also want to thank our producer, Connor Crosby, who is behind the scenes, pulling all the strings, making it all happen. You can find him at ignitionvisuals.com. and on Twitter at Ignition Visuals. And of course, Matt Russell and his team over there at Gain Structure Sound at gainstructure.com. That is who mixes and masters and makes the show sound so delicious. It's not me, I'll tell you that. I send everything to Matt, Go Creative Show, and BC Media Projects. He is the best in the business, and if you guys want to use him and hire him for your projects, you can. Just don't get in the way of any Go Creative Show episodes. You can find him at gainstructure.com. And of course, we will see you next week on another episode of Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers.